Um, Hello, everyone, and welcome to VSA Online. I'm so happy that you are all here, despite all this confusing cancellation messages circling around yesterday. So thank you for coming. Today I have a pleasure to welcome Sven Krausse from Jülich Forschungszentrum in Aachen, Germany, or in Jülich, I guess. And before I leave the floor to him, so I want to remind you that we compiled a very exciting program for this season. So please stay tuned, check our program, and we will see each other every fortnight. So without any further delay, Sven, please.
Thanks, Evgeny, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation to talk here. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Right, so we all have to solve navigation tasks essentially on a daily basis, whether this is just us having to go to work or getting back home, or whether we just want to find the nearest coffee machine. We want to solve navigation tasks quite frequently. And one key challenge when you want to solve a navigation task is that you would want to have a meaningful representation of your own position in the world and position of other stuff that is around you. In other words, what you want is a cognitive map. And that our brains can do this is actually quite an impressive feat given the sensory input that gets to our system. Because when you think about this, when you go about your day-to-day life, you observe everything from your own egocentric point of view and one time point after the other. But still, when I now ask you, where can I get the nearest coffee? You don't have to retrace back the sequence of events to find the last time that you got a coffee to tell me that I have to retrace the exact steps that you took. You can just point me in one direction and say, this way, that's where the coffee machine is. And this is already an example of you using a consolidated, allocentric cognitive map to solve a navigation task. And these maps come with a bunch of really nice advantages. So for one, they minimize the amount of redundancy that you have to store. Instead of storing each object every time that you encounter it, you just put it on the map, store it once, and then you can just recall it whenever you revisit that point of view. And for another, what you can do is shortcut reasoning. That is exactly the example with the coffee machine here. When you're at this position and you want to find the nearest path to the tree, you don't have to retrace the training steps, but you can just go the direct line to this tree. And this is a really powerful inductive bias because it's essentially generalizing out of its training context. And this is also what got us really excited in how the brain is actually solving these sorts of problems and how this representation in the brain is actually produced. And we wanted to understand this. And in this talk, I want to explain to you a little bit of the journey that we took to get to our current best version explanation of how we can actually build these sort of meaningful representations. So let's essentially start by asking a question: what do we need to form a cognitive map? And you essentially need two things. You need to know what stuff is, and you need to know where stuff is. So in other words, you need to have some representation that tells you this is a tree, and you have to have some representation of a spatial metric that gives you some XY coordinates in space, so to say. And then finally, the most crucial thing of them, what you have to do is you have to somehow be able to bind these two representations together, to combine them into the one encoding that tells you the tree is at the position XY. And at that point, you actually derive at this cognitive map. So when we look at the neuroscience literature about how your spatial metric could be encoded, there's quite a lot of interesting studies on especially grid cell activity and continuous attractor models that give you this continuous encoding of space, but they really lack the ability to have any other sensory input, like visual input, into their model. On the other hand, for the pure semantic encoding, the pure symbolic kind of stuff, we know just historically that vector symbolic architectures are a really good fit, hence the term symbolic even in the name of the VSA. So what we wanted to do is to think about the grid cell activity and the known models in the neuroscience literature and try to see whether we can actually find the equivalent version of this through the lens of a vector symbolic architecture. And in doing this, I will derive here also in this talk how we can get to what we call the grid cell VSA that actually combines the best of the two worlds and represents both abstract semantic encodings and a spatial encoding. And once we went through all the theory and hopefully you understood how we can derive this grid cell VSA, I will then show in the second half of this talk some of the applications that we can do with this. And in the first iteration, just to show you that this is actually an analog of what we see in grid cell activity. The first part is just a purely spatial integration task that reproduces grid cell-like activities in the pattern. But still, it is a fully functioning vector symbolic architecture. So you could do any of the more abstract tasks that you would imagine from a VSA to come out of this. The example that we showed also in the paper, and that I will briefly introduce here, is abstract analogy reasoning. In our example, it's the analogy between two family trees, but it's very reminiscent of, for example, the Dollar of Mexico task or stuff like this. So we have this spatial part, we have this abstract representation part, but the very interesting thing that we can now do is we can mix and match the two. So we can have these mixed representations where we can encode both spatial variables and categorical variables to describe, for example, a short-term memory of we saw the grapes at this position in the room and at this point in time. And we ended our paper at this point, and this is the official part of the talk, but still I would like to spend the last 10 minutes of this talk to talk about our ongoing work, which I think is the most exciting thing that we can actually derive from this. And this is a model that we call the visually guided path integration. And in this model, what I want to convince you about is that what we know from our grid cell states is not necessarily just that they describe your one position in space, as we would imagine from continuous attractor models, but they actually introduce a lot of encoding of our surroundings to anchor themselves to this environment. And in looking at the grid cell activity from this VSA perspective, we get some novel understanding of what these grid cells could actually encode and how they actually are anchored to the physical environment. So enough of the teasing, enough of the introduction part. Let's go to the first major part and talk about what grid cells actually are. And to introduce this here, I brought a little video from the Moser lab, who first discovered the grid cells in 2005, and then later even got a Nobel Prize for their work together with John O'Keefe for spatial encoding and place selectivity. So in here, what you see is a mouse that is running around in the square box, and it's being recorded from in the entorhinal cortex. And here, for one example neuron, each time this neuron has been firing, this little marker was put on the screen. And you can see by now, since the video has been running for quite some time, that there's this pattern emerging of these different blobs of activity. And a different way to reimagine what this is saying is essentially the neuron is giving us the information that whenever it fires, you're at one of these blobs of position. So this alone does not really tell you much because you don't know at which of the different blobs you are. But thankfully, you have more than one grid cell in your brain. So you have a bunch of them and they have different spatial scales, meaning the distances between the bumps, and different orientations of the pattern. They are slightly rotated. And finally, they could be also phase shifted from one another. So if we, for example, take this image here, we have this one pattern with this spatial scale and orientation. And then there's a second neuron with the same spatial scale and orientation, just that the activity is slightly shifted in one direction. That would be a phase shift in here. And while one neuron only tells you that you are at one of the different blobs, if you have multiple of these grid cells active together, and then you take their receptive fields and you just stack them on top of one another with the different spatial frequencies, what you will end up with is this unique position encoding that gives you this kernel that just tells you you're at this one position in space, because they only constructively interfere at the one location that you actually are in, and all the other periodic receptive fields will cancel each other out because they are different for the different neurons. The final thing that I want to introduce from the experimental side from the grid cell activity is that these different scales and orientations, they are not just random. They are actually very neatly structured in the entorhinal cortex into something called modules. And within each module, you have a number of different grid cells with the same spatial scale and orientation, and they are just phase shifted so that they will cover the entire physical space. And there's this paper here from Stan Sola et al. In 2012, also from the Moser lab, and they showed this quite impressively where they recorded from, in this example, 62 different grid cells. And you can see here the grid spacing on the y-axis, meaning the distance between the blobs. And you can see that all of the neurons here align really nicely on these 4 levels, meaning they were able to record from 4 different modules in parallel, where each neuron has the same scale and orientation, just slightly shifted. Okay, so we got all of this experimental evidence. How can we now combine this into one theoretical model? And this led the works from, for example, McNaughton et al. Here to the, I would say by now, de facto standard model of what we think grid cells are doing, which is the continuous attractor model. In this continuous attractor model, what we can think about is we want to encode this 2D space here. Somehow we want to encode our position into space. And the first thing that we could do is we can create this sheet of neurons where each neuron is telling us when this is active that you're at this position in space, for example. So if the mouse is now here at the center, you see this blob of activity that encodes that the mouse is now active at this position. And the way that you can make this stable is you can create a specific connectivity pattern where you have local excitation and global inhibition, meaning that if this neuron is active right now, it sends an excitatory signal to its neighbor, but a global inhibition signal to all the neurons, leading to the stable bump of activity. If the animal now moves, what you want to do is you want to shift this bump of activity around here on this sheet. And the way that you can do that is essentially by just giving it some external input to the direction where you want to move the bump in. So if we, for example, think about sending some excitatory signal here a little bit to the right of the bump, what will happen is that these neurons get active and send a local excitatory signal and a global inhibition signal. And this will lead to the fact that the bump moves a little bit to the side. So the way that this external input is typically thought about and typically generated is by this full model for the grid cell activity here, for which we have to introduce two different cell types also. The one would be a head direction cells. And for all intents and purposes, you can just think of them as just a neural compass. So if this neuron is firing here, it tells you that you're moving to the east. And then you also need something called conjunctive cells. And what they do is they represent the joint information of your position and your direction. In other words, when these neurons are firing here, they tell you you're currently at this position and you're right now moving in the east direction. So the last thing that you need is some asymmetric weight connectivity pattern between this conjunctive sheet of neurons and the original grid cells here that are slightly shifted towards the east side of the bump. So meaning the mouse is at this position, the conjunctive cells are active because it's moving east, so the excitatory signal is moving to the east side of this. And if the animal is not moving at all, the conjunctive cells are just way less active and we get our stable bump that is not moving around. Okay, so this is a really nice way to have a bump of position encoding and shift it around. But the question remains, what happens when we run out of neurons? So what happens when we run out of this sheet of neurons? And the answer to this in the continuous attractor model is pretty much just you're playing Pac-Man. So when you're running down at the bottom, you're coming back in at the top. If you're running back out of the right-hand side, you're coming back in on the left-hand side. In other words, you get periodic boundary conditions in here. And this exactly leads to the periodic receptive fields that we've also seen in the experimental data. Because if you think about this bump of activity that encodes this position, if we shift the bump to the right and to the right, it will move back into the other side. And then if the neuron is active again, it could also encode the position that is just spatially shifted by one period to the right or to the upper or lower direction. Okay, so these periodic boundary conditions lead to our periodic receptive fields, and we now have the activity of this bump here shifting around with this essentially this toroidal structure if you fold this together. The last thing that we have to do is we have to create this for the different modules that we've seen in the previous slide, where just the activity is just shifted by different spatial amounts when you move, say, 1 meter to the side, the different bumps in the different modules shift by different amounts. And this is now essentially the complete model of how you can describe what the different grid cell modules do to give you this really nice, noise-robust and distributed code of where you are in space. The only problem with this is that all of this only describes path integration, right? You only integrate your movement ever. There's no external anchoring to any cues that you have in the environment. And if you ever fancy a self-experiment, you can just close your eyes and go down to the hallway of your office and just run up and down the hallway. You will find that you're actually not that good at path integrating. You will find that you will quite quickly be not as accurate of your estimation of where you are in space. So you actually need some external visual or other sensory input that tells you, actually, if I see this, if I'm now 1 meter next to this door, I'm at this position, I should anchor my grid cell code to this one position. And this was our key motivation to start here and say, okay, but how does that work? How can we introduce this visual anchoring, the spatial information into this sort of model for the grid cell architecture? And we thought maybe this would help if we reframe this in another framework where we also know that we can encode symbolic stuff like there's a door to my right-hand side and stuff like this. And this led us to thinking about vector symbolic architectures. Now, I know that I'm talking to the expert audience on vector symbolic architecture, so I will keep this brief. But maybe there's some new people in the audience, or maybe you just fancy a New Year's refresher for the first talk in the series. So here's my short crash course on the VSA, if you will. So what you want to do typically is you operate on very high dimensional vectors. And when I say high dimensional, it's something like a 10K vector, for example. And if you have trouble like me thinking in 10,000 dimensions, the way that I like to imagine this is essentially you just have a list of neurons and they have some activation state. They can either be active or inactive. Now what you do is you draw a random activation pattern, just some random vector, and associate that with one specific symbol. So for example, the random activation pattern could be the symbol of a banana. And then you can do this a second time, draw a second random vector, and associate that with the concept of the color yellow. What this now makes, why this is now an algebra in the end, is that we have a multiplicative operation that we call binding and an additive operation that we call bundling. And the multiplicative operation, it takes its two input vectors and it produces a new output vector that is dissimilar to both of its input vectors. But we can still think of this as associated with the joint features of the two input vectors. So binding the color yellow and banana then result in a vector that we could think about as the yellow banana, for example. The nice thing about this is that we have the binding operation in here, and there's the inverse unbinding operation also, meaning that we can extract both of the features, the banana and the color yellow, back from our original representation. For the second operation, the bundling, this is essentially just taking two input vectors and producing a vector that is as similar as possible to both of its input vectors, thereby essentially describing the set of the two different features. So if we bundle banana and apple, the resulting representation would encode there's a banana and there's an apple. Now, what can we do with this? Here's a very quick example where we just have our different base vectors that we encode with random vectors, the banana, strawberry, apple, and the colors yellow and red. And we call this our code book typically. And what we can do with this is, for example, just encode all the fruits that we know. So we have our yellow banana, we have our red strawberry, and the red apple. And we bundle them all together to get one representation that encodes the fruits that we know. And if we want to now query that vector, we can, for example, ask, what are the red fruits that we know? And you can write this mathematically by unbinding the color red. And because binding and unbinding are associative, what ends up happening is that this operation acts on each element in the bundle. So what we end up getting is in this vector here, we have the yellow banana, unbound the color red, and the same thing for the strawberry and the apple. So because we have the binding and the unbinding in here, these two operations just cancel each other out, and the end result of the red fruits vector is that we have our apple bundled with our strawberry, bundled with this weird combination that we don't really know how to interpret, but that's okay. We can essentially just treat this as extra noise on our system and start the readout process, which is just computing the similarity with all the vectors that we do know, in our case, all the vectors that we have in our codebook. And the result that gets out of this looks something like this, where we get the high similarity for the strawberry and the apple, for us answering the question of what are the red fruits in the representation that we know. So this is just a very basic example of what we can do for symbolic computations and manipulating categorical variables, like this is a fruit, this is a banana, this is an apple, and how we can bind them together to make these joint representations of combined features, essentially. The one thing that is missing from this point of view of a VSA is how you can encode also continuous variables, spatial variables. How can you encode a position in here? And in trying to derive this sort of system, what we will end up with in the end is exactly the grid set VSA. So let's start with the question, how can we encode space with these neurons? And we again start with our random vector of activity. And what we now want is we essentially want to encode the position of this mouse. And for simplicity, let's just stick to a 1D representation where we can just move along this line, or the mouse can just move along this line. And the most straightforward way to solve this probably would be to just say, okay, each neuron just gets a receptor field where it is active at one of the positions. And when we are at this position right here, we're in the receptor field of the 7th neuron. So we activate this. We have a one-hot encoded vector. It perfectly tells us where we are. and we can just move on with our lives. So are we done yet? Is this already a position code that we can create? Well, not quite, because we don't really know what happens after the 12th neuron. We say we are restricted to the number of neurons that we have. We can't just spawn new neurons. We could repeat our code, but since we are still restricted to the 12 neurons, after the 12th neuron, if we say this is neuron 1 again, we have now an ambiguous code whether we are at this position or at this position. So our coding range is still fixed to the width of the 12 neurons. We could widen our receptor fields, but that just decreases the resolution of our code. So all of these solutions don't really work. So let's think back of what we know about the grid cells and remember that they had this modular structure. They had the different modules at different spatial frequencies. So that sounds kind of useful. So let's build this also. And for those of you in the know, this will then in the end essentially look like the sparse block coding that we see also in the LIO work here. So what we can then do is we say we split our vector up into 3 modules, and each of the modules has 4 neurons in them. And for module 1, they have quite a wide receptor field here, meaning that if we move along the activity, we have a low spatial frequency. So it takes a long time before the vector shifts around back to the very beginning. So you can see each of the modules is a periodic encoding here. And then the second and the third module have faster frequencies, with the second module being medium fast and the third module being very fast in its repeating code. So if we now want to encode our position in space, if we now want to encode our position in space here, we actually get this combination where we have this one hot encoded vector per module. So now we have the activity pattern of 3, 3, and 4 encoding this one position in space. And now this is really nice because we do see this repeating pattern. So if we just look at module 3, we don't know whether we are at this position or at this position. But that doesn't really matter because we have the combination of the different neurons. And you can actually theoretically show that while this first version that I presented, where you just have the one module, the coding range grows linearly with the number of neurons that you add. In this setting here, where you have the multiple modules at different spatial frequencies, provided that you choose your frequencies correctly, you essentially have an exponential coding range that you can cover with these with the same number of neurons instead of a linear one. So now we have this more distributed kind of code. We have this wider coding range at the same spatial resolution. The last thing that we need to make this actually VSA is not just the encoding principle, but also the update principle or the binding principle. And for the binding operation, what we actually want is we want to say, okay, we define some update vector, delta x, and this should correspond to essentially the amount of space that we've been moving. And if we bind this to our original representation, what we want to get out as a vector in the end is the new position of the animal, so at this new point in time in here. So you can see here, the activity should be shifting then at the next time point, and then we should have the new activity pattern of this 4, 1, and 3. And this is where the different spatial frequencies come into play. So we said that the first module has a very low spatial frequency. It repeats very slowly over and over again. So we only need to shift the activity by a small amount. And now what we want to do, mathematically speaking, is we want to implement the binding operation as a modular circular convolution. So we take a circular convolution of this first module of the x of t vector and the first module of the delta x vector. And now if you define it in a way where this would be this one neuron in here, what ends up happening if you convolve 2 one-hot encoded vectors is that you just shift the activity by one place, essentially. It stays the same if you have the first neuron active, you shift it by 2 or by 3 if you have the lower neurons active and do the circular convolution again. So this is exactly what we do in the second and the third module. And what ends up happening is we say, okay, doing the circular convolution here shifts our activity by 1 step, and that corresponds to exactly shifting this activity by 1 receptor field to the side. And then for the second and the third module, we get the faster frequencies and derive at exactly the same point. And I hope by now you already are kind of seeing that we get some very similar kind of codes that we see in the grid cell activity. We get our modular, sparse, distributed code along the different spatial modules. Each module has its own spatial frequency, where each neuron within one module has the same receptor field pattern, just slightly phase shifted from one another. And between modules, we have the different spatial frequencies that we get. And to update our position, all we have to do is shift our activity around within the one module. Here we do this with the circular convolution. In the continuous attractor, you would do this with the extra input from the conjunctive sets. The main difference now being for this grid cell architecture is that they do this in a continuous space and not just in this one-hot encoded way, and that they do this in 2 dimensions. So let's take these 2 generalization steps next.
Just a quick question for clarification, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
I thought you said it's a convolution that you do for the shift, but then what you have shown in the slide here, it looks like the binding operator. Is that meant to be standing for a convolution, or are you really doing the binding to sparse block?
Yes. So exactly in the introduction in the operation that we're doing, we're defining the binding operation in our in this VSA as doing a module-wise circular convolution.
So that does not mean element-wise multiplication, the way you're using this.
No, it does not.
Okay.
No, it does not. It's just a general binding, as in combining 2 vectors and reproducing a dissimilar output vector.
Got it. Thanks.
All right. Right. So the state that we had so far is we have this one position and we do this one-hot encoding within our module that tells us that we're at this position in space. And instead of doing it one-hot, because this only gets us to represent one neuron state at a time, so we only can shift by one module step essentially, we can also make this a continuous activation. And what we can do is, for example, we define this cosine here, where the amplitude of the cosine is exactly phase shifted to the point that we want to encode in space. And then we just discretize this cosine by sampling this at the positions of the different neurons, ending up with this activation pattern that you see over here with the one module that then repeats here again over there. When we now want to do a binding operation, we still do the same thing. We do a module-wise circular convolution, and the property still holds that we essentially just shift our activity pattern. Because if you take the circular convolution of 2 cosines, provided you do the correct normalization, what ends up happening is that your cosine pattern just shifts its bump of activity over. And here you can already see an example that if the location is actually between the 2 different receptor fields of the neurons, you will actually still get a essentially sub-pixel resolution or sub-receptor field width resolution of where you want to be in space. And I think here it's critical to disclaim a lot of the inspiration and the work that has been previously done and previously pointed out these different links, because we are not the ones that came up with this. There is a bunch of work that looked at these representations in complex space. So essentially you take the Fourier transform of this cosine, end up getting a phasor representation, just a complex number with a phase. And then you do, just as you, Bruno said, do element-wise multiplication in the complex domain. And once you do this, you get exactly the same pattern because you just do the phase shift in the complex domain, essentially. And then there's also the work, for example, from the Elias-Smith group that did the spatial semantic pointer architecture that actually translated back and forth between the Fourier space and the real domain to even do the link to also the grid selectivity that has also been shown in the holographic reduced representations over there. So a bunch of this work to make this continuous work is very related to what we see in this architecture. But what we now want to do is we want to make a very explicit representation where we can map pretty much one-to-one the different modules that we see in the VSA vector activity to what we would see in neural data to have a working model of what we think we can observe in the brain. And the final step that we need to take for this is to now generalize this idea of the 1D encoding into a 2-dimensional space. So if we just plot what we have so far in 2D, what we get is this stripy pattern, essentially. We have the cosine activity on the one direction here that we can encode, but on the y-axis, we don't have any pattern at all. But the key thing to realize now is if we repeat the same thing 2 more times, just in a different orientation of the pattern, and we just add the activity together, we get exactly the sort of pattern that we're after. We're getting this hexagonal kind of encoding that we see that we want to see from the grid selectivity. So in other words, we start out with our receptor field and want to say where we say that we want to encode a bump at these positions here for our one module. So to create the activity of the module, we can do the same thing that we did before. Along one of the symmetry axes of the hexagonal pattern, we do the cosine encoding and create this representation from there. But we have to repeat this 2 more times to get the 2 additional axes of our hexagonal pattern. And to represent this in one combined representation for this one module with this one spatial structure, we just encode exactly these 3 lines here, these 3 cosine patterns that we have to add up along the dimensions of a cube. So we have one axis over here, and if your bump of activity were to shift along this axis, then the bump of activity were also to shift along this axis here as well. And the same thing for the second and the third axis over here. They encode the second and the third bump of activity. And notice that these are quite tightly coupled to one another, because these are, although we have 3 axes in here, they are actually projected onto a 2D plane, so they are actually linked to one another, and you cannot just have any phase combination of the activity pattern in here. But this is essentially the way that you can encode the one module of activity. And just as we were to see in grid cell-like activity, if we want to update this position, meaning that new neurons should be active and this bump should move around essentially within the one module, the bump of activity should be shifting around within this cube of neurons. So this is how we can create one module, but we've been seeing over and over again, the one module doesn't really tell you much. You need multiple scales and multiple orientations to essentially have the unique position encoding, because you need the different spatial frequencies. But the nice thing about this encoding is you can just repeat it for different spatial scales and orientations. You can just define a set of scales that you want to have and define a set of orientations, and then repeat the same pattern. You draw your three axes that you want to have, you encode the cosine along the 3 patterns of the coordinate that you want to encode, and then you get a new cube of neurons. Or I will start to call them modules now to make the link more explicit to the neuroscience and the continuous attractor model here. So this ends up with these stacked modules that we have of the different activity pattern. And the final thing that we do, just as we did in the 1D case, is we subsample them, but to just get a 3x3x3 module of neurons. In the implementation, it's just essentially a 3-index NumPy array with the dimensions 3x3x3. The reason why we're taking 3, by the way, is that 3 equidistant points are the minimum number that you have to take to have a unique cosine pattern, because if you just have 2, you could have been phase shifted by 180 degrees. So this is the minimum amount of representation where you can do still the circular convolution trick. And this is exactly what we're doing. If we now want to have the binding operation, it's still the same thing as in 1D. We do a circular convolution, just that we now have to do this along all of the 3 axes. So we have to do the 3D circular convolution in a module-wise manner. And we've seen in the 1D case that binding 2 vectors that encode one position and an update vector, binding together leads to this shift of activity in the encoded space. And the same property is still true in our 2D encoded space. If we encode some vector u and we encode some vector v, we bind them together. What comes out is a representation of a position that we could get from just the vector addition in the latent space also. So the key message from here, binding operation in VSA space is vector addition in the low-dimensional, 2-dimensional physical space that we want to encode. Okay, so I hope it was somewhat clear of what we wanted to do with what this grid cell VSA is actually doing. So now let's look at what we can actually do with this. What are the different stuff that we showed in the experiment? And why is this not working? We're back. All right. So in the first, in general, what we can do is we've seen that we can encode these spatial variables, and we can actually also encode other continuous variables. I will show in one example. For example, we can create a time encoding in here. But we can also encode just anything that you know from the VSA themselves, just categorical stuff. We can just draw a random vector and associate them with a symbol to make computations with them. So the final concept that we need for the continuous variables is something called fractional power encoding. And the idea here is quite straightforward, actually. So again, let's take this one position in space, and we want to have some update delta x to get to this position. And let's say we define this as a base vector. And you can think of a base vector as just saying you're moving, let's say, 1 meter forward in this direction. So if I bind base x to this, it's the equivalent of moving 1 step forward. And we can repeat this and go 1 step further and say, okay, now we move 2 meters. What can we do? We just bind the base x vector again. And the crucial insight is that in some of the different VSA families that there are, for example, the Fourier holographic reduced representations and also this representation that we are having here, we are not restricted to having integer powers in this. We can not only apply this vector a full time, but we can also, for example, apply this 2.5 times. And the reason for this being is that we can actually do exactly this Fourier trick, going into Fourier space, doing element-wise multiplication. If we apply this multiple times, it's just to the power of, and therefore we can get exactly the same behavior here to encode any real value and not just integer values that we would see in the space vector notation. Okay, what we can do with this is we can just now sample a random path. So here on the left-hand side, you see an example of just this square box, and the color map and the background is the similarity readout from the grid cell VSA vector. And what we did is we just drew random numbers to say move one step forward, one step left, and negative 3.5 steps in the y direction, and then do this path integration. In the middle here, you see a slice of the different modules that you would see, and you can see that the bump of activity is quite erratically shifting around here because I sped it up quite fast to see on the right-hand side the activity pattern of one example neuron. So I'm just taking one of the neurons and one of the modules, and then saying that if it's above a threshold, I would think of this as like a firing probability or a firing rate. If it's above this threshold, we just draw a little marker here on the screen, and we actually see exactly that in the physical 2D space where we are navigating, we can reconstruct this hexagonal pattern that we by design put in there. So this is a good just sanity check to see we designed this to reproduce what we know from the continuous attractors and grid cells. So this should actually then also emerge from our activity pattern. The second thing that we can do with this is combined representations. So not just the physical representation of X and Y, but also combining this with categorical features like this would be a grape at this position. We can bind all of them together to say we have the banana at the position X, Y, and Y, X and Y, and let's also put in a time encoding here. It's some temporal point, and then have this working memory of the different points in space. Now, this alone is a bit of a nightmare to read out again, because we have this one representation that takes all of these factors bound together. But there's also previous work again from Paxton Frady and others also in the Sommer and Olshausen lab, and also my supervisor Alpha worked on this, where how you can factorize this combined state of the multiple factors. And the core intuition is that you essentially take guesses for what your different factors are in the state, and then you unbind 3 out of the 4 guesses, in our case here, the y position, the time, and the object itself. So if these guesses are correct, what comes out of this should be your X location. Then you send it through a cleanup of a codebook and a nonlinearity, and this is now your new best guess. And you repeat this over and over again. You iterate this multiple times, and then over time, this should converge to a combination of factors that best explain your S vector altogether. And here's one example where you see the resonator iterations on the y-axis from top to bottom, and the codebooks on the x-axis for the x, y, time, and object. And you can see that in the beginning, the resonator is still shifting around to find its correct position, and then converging to the right combination that explains the different factors. So we've seen the purely spatial stuff. We've seen the combined representations. For completeness, let me mention that you can also do very abstract things with this. You can encode graph-like structures, for example, this family tree, and do reasoning by analogy tasks. Here, for example, deriving this concept of an uncle as an analogy between the 2 different trees. I will not go into details of this, and will refer to the paper if you're interested in this. Instead, in the interest of time, I will actually shift to the final part and spend the last few minutes to talk about our ongoing work, which I'm really excited about, which is this visually guided path integration. Because now we've seen that we have this mixed representation of objects and position encodings together. We can now actually think about how is our grid cell code really anchored in physical space? How does it know where it has to put its origin point, essentially, from which it can compute your own allocentric location? And so if we go back to the very beginning, remember that we said all the observations that you get are in this egocentric reference frame. You're by definition looking into your head direction, and all that you're getting is the relative distances to objects and the angles that you get between the objects. So in this case, the distance and the bearing to the bank. Bearing would be this egocentric angle. So all the observation that you're getting out of this is just this tree is at this distance and bearing, and the same for bank and house. So how can we use this to actually create a grid set code? Now, the key insight here is that we can write this down as the combination of the ID of the tree, which would be some random vector encoding this feature that there is a tree. And we can encode also the position vector of where this is in space. And the way that we can do this is again with these fractional power encoding trick with the base x and base y. Note here that we shift the bearing angle that we have for our one position with the head direction. And this is essentially the transformation that tells you there's a tree from the to my left side, to the transformation into the allocentric angle that tells you there's a tree in the northeast direction, for example. So we assume that we have the stable head direction system over here. And once we can have this, we can derive the grid cell state as this combination of ID and position vectors, or ID and distance vectors overall. And what we took from all of this is that this combination actually describes your unique position in space. So you can define your position as the relative distances to all the stuff that is around you. And you will get a unique encoding that is only true at this point in space. So once you have this, we actually get a unique code that looks like a grid cell vector because we designed the grid cell VSA to look like a grid cell vector. And you get just this starting point to say, here we are, this is our anchoring point of our position in space, without ever having to actually define your zero coordinate from which you start path integrating, essentially. Just a quick side note on the stable head direction thing in here. If you're wondering how you can get the stable head direction, we actually spent quite a lot of time working on this and looking at a lot of data to analyze this. Here's the preprint that's currently under review if we want to check this out. But for all purposes being in this talk here, we just assume you get a stable head direction, you essentially just get a compass that you can use. So what can we do now with this representation? We have our state, it's the bundle of all the objects here with this ID and position updates. And now let's say we want to move by some vector here, which I call p move to this new location. And previously what we did is we wanted to do this, we just bind the activity. The only thing that is now different here, instead of binding, there's this unbinding here, and this should become clear in a second why we're doing this. Because if we write this out, the state here and then unbinding the movement vector, it's again associative, adding on all the elements in the bundle. So we can write this out as the bundle of all the object IDs, their previous positions. So in the case of the house, for example, this is this p house of time point t, and then unbinding this move vector. But remember, when we say binding, it's nothing else than vector addition in our physical space, and unbinding correspondingly is just vector subtraction, essentially. So if we say this pi of t unbound the p move vector, what we just do is the vector subtraction of this minus this, so we end up with this vector here. But this vector is nothing else than our new position, new distance vector from our new location to the new house over here. So this is the pi of t plus 1 that we get in this encoding. And so this was essentially our main insight that we got here, that once we construct our grid cell state as not just describing you're at position xy, but as describing you're at the position that is defined by the distances of everything around you, then once we do the path integration, we end up with the equivalent representation at the new location as when we were to just look around and just reevaluate this from the sensory input to reconstruct this bundle here again. And this is really critical, that these two representations are exactly the same, whether you do it in one way or the other way, because now you can do very easy just a weighted average between these two estimations and combine the path integration with a visual estimation. So say you have your path integrator that takes your previous state and it now binds, or in this case unbinds, this movement vector that you get from your speed and your head direction in which you're moving. And on the other hand, you also have your visual representation that at your new location looks around, takes in all the distances and bearing angles that it gets from the visual features, and creates this representation by bundling them all together. And then you take the weighted mean between the two to get your new combined state, and you just iterate this over and over again. And this is a really robust system because when the path integration accumulates noise, because this p-move is maybe not the most accurate kind of representation of how much you moved, then your visual representation will pull you back and avoid this drifting over time. But when your vision representation fails you for some time, say you close your eyes and don't get a vision representation, or you just see a subset of all the features that are in space, you will still integrate for some time the previous states in this combined state, therefore not completely losing your position in space just by this one by losing some of the visual features, because you can still path integrate them. And so we have this sensory fusion between these two systems here. And the final simulation that I want to show you here is this one example where we just have this very simple black box again, and these colored pixels are the different features that the agent can see and get its distance and bearing angles from it. And we run it in 3 simulations. The one is just path integration, so just getting updates of you moved by 1 meter. Or just some amount, and the other is just visual information, just getting the bearing and distances. And in both cases, we add some noise to the estimation so that they alone are not perfectly accurate. And then in the visually guided path integration, we do exactly what I showed in the previous slide. We get these 2 representations and we take the weighted mean. And crucially, we put the same noise onto the system. So when we run the simulation, you can actually see that the visual estimation jumps around quite erratically around the actual location that it should encode, because you just get different noise for the different features every time you see them. Whereas in the integration alone, you just see that the bump activity just from time to time drifts away from the position that you wanted to have. Whereas the combination of the visually guided path integration here on the bottom quite accurately keeps track of where you are in space. And you can also see this here in this Euclidean distance error plot over time, that actually this combination of the 2 features allows us to have a really noise robust system, that both of these different sources of noise, where one is integrating and the other one is just jumping around, tend to cancel each other out and give you a very robust encoding of where you are in space. Okay, so that was all that I brought for you today. So let's get through a quick summary where we started out with looking at the experimental evidence in the grid selectivity and introducing the continuous attractor model. And we soon noticed that one thing that there is missing from this is this idea that you want to put in some visual information, some extra sensory information. And to get to this, what we did is we designed this grid cell VSA with this very specific encoding structure with these cubes here of the different modules to encode the different neurons. And we looked at a bunch of different experiments, for example, the path integration and the combined feature representation, which then finally led us to this idea that you can actually do this combination to describe your grid cell state, not just as your own position, but as the combination of distances that are around you to do this visually guided path integration. So all that's left for me to do is just have a shameless self-plug here for the 2 different works that we did on the topic, the one being the grid cell VSA introduction that I presented here in this talk, and then the second one also being the head direction stuff and how you can get to a stable head direction model in here. So feel free to check them out. And here's just the declaration of our funding. And the final thing would be to thank the 2 institutes, PGI 14 and 15, for being amazing collaborators and colleagues, and especially my supervisors, Emre, Alpha, and Johannes, for guiding me through this project and for all the work with this. Also, the external collaborators with Melika and Fritz on the project. So with that, thank you all for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Sven, thank you very much. It's very exciting talk indeed. So we have questions. So Bruno was first raising the hand.
Oh, thanks. Okay. First of all, Sven, really nice work. And it's very exciting,
Thanks.
especially to see this idea about how to update the spatial map from visual landmarks and so forth using VSA. I think I just want to make maybe a kind of a general comment to begin with. Having worked with Chris Kim on his model of the grid cell system, and also a model for how you bind context to the spatial representation, incorporating ideas very similar to what you talked about. I'm a little bit kind of surprised, maybe shocked that there wasn't more mention of that as context. Chris gave a talk about his work about a year ago here on VSA Online. And maybe this is kind of just a general comment about working together as a community. It's important that we acknowledge each other's contributions and the relationships between them, because the relationships are really super interesting here. Chris was using this complex phasor encoding of residue numbers at different spatial scales with multiplicative binding. Here you're using the sparse block code with convolutional binding. I imagine there's advantages and disadvantages of one scheme versus the other. It'd be super amazing to understand that. So I think that's important for us as a community to try to understand the differences, of these different approaches. The other, also relation is in terms of how you code 2D space. This idea of the triangular coordinate coding is something also Chris incorporated in his work. And a tricky thing about that is that if you just do a naive triangular encoding, to take 2D and project it into those 3D basis vectors like you showed, then you get a redundancy in the representation of 2D space, and you don't get any advantage of the triangular coding system. It's just merely doing, you're just doing it because of biological mimicry. You're not gaining any sort of coding advantage. And what Chris really figured out there was that in order to make this efficient representation of 2D space, using the triangular coordinate system, that you have to choose the phases of those three vectors, those base vectors, appropriately so that the phases cancel. And that, so when you move in all three directions, it basically cancels out to the origin. And then you realize the coding advantages of the triangular coordinate system. So I also just wanted to point that out. So I get it's just kind of a general comment about there. It'd be nice to understand the relationship between these methods. Beautiful work. I love what you're showing. It's just brilliant. This idea of how you update space, looking at visual landmarks. So that's entirely new, goes beyond anything Chris did. But it would have been really lovely to hear more about this from the outset, as like staging the context within the VSA community, especially since it was already presented on VSA Online and so forth, to put this in context and understand the relationships of these different contributions. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, so definitely. And I honestly, I think I actually missed this in the talk slide, but had this when we did the different, when I said with the different spatial frequencies in here, I think I had the reference to this, but didn't mention it to this. And we're citing this in the paper that it's exactly coming down to the residue kind of work that Chris did in this work. And I think even Alpha and him had a lot of discussions when Alpha was there, and they talked a lot about this. Honestly, I'm not that familiar with the exact link with this canceling of the phases, so I would be very happy to discuss this a little bit more in detail afterwards to see where we can go with this. But yeah, definitely. And if I offended anyone with missing this out, just definitely, I'm sorry, and I'm trying to cite everything that I'm aware of. So
good.
So let's see if we have more questions. Well, I have a couple of questions on my own. One really about you mentioned that this semantic graphs that you or knowledge graphs example. So is it reported in some other paper than the one you presented, or is part of that of the same paper?
So it is very reminiscent of the idea, for example, with the dollar of Mexico, where you do an analogy between two representations that you construct in this just key value kind of memory sort of representation. Just that in this example that we showed in this paper here, we just reframed it a little bit to encode family tree examples. There's also work actually on general tree encoding in the Paxton Frady work. I think it's this vector function algebra thing that he's doing with these vector encodings in there. Wait, where was I? Yeah, here. So the general thing that you have to think about here is that you have to have not only a binding or unbinding, but actually have some sort of permutation to get down the tree, to not have just ambiguous encodings when you go left or right, because binding itself would be a commutative operation, and you have to somehow break this commutativity there. And we actually solve this by doing another operation in this grid cell code, where we can actually also not only do a convolution within each block, but we can do this along the rotation and scale axis. And when we do this along the rotation axis, then this would be our permutation kind of operation that we use to encode these sorts of trees. But the underlying idea is pretty much just this analogy reasoning task.
Yes, thank you. So I definitely will read more in the paper, but maybe you can give a hint on relation of dimensionality of your encoding and the number of landmarks that you can track in the system. In this,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, so definitely. So we didn't do this extensively, but with some preliminary stuff that we looked at, we just essentially we take these 3 by 3 by 3 neurons, being 27 neurons, and then we create 5 different scales and 7 different orientations, for example, to have all the different blocks. And so we end up with not that big vectors actually, and then we see that if we keep bundling stuff onto the vector, we end up with a capacity of approximately 50 items that we could bundle into the system in the setting in here. The neat thing in this sort of model in here is I would not think of this as your complete cognitive map. This is not your whole representation. I would rather think of this as your working memory of your index that is actually in the activity itself. So you would have to have some additional consolidation mechanism in the end that actually takes this out into longer form storage than just in the bundle of the activity in here. But just the bundle taking the few salient features that you have in the room, or even just 20, 30 features that you have in the room. And once you leave the room and you get a new feature, then your grid cell code will re-anchor. And we actually see this in experiments, right? So we know that there's remapping activity in grid cells where they change from room to room and change when the geometry and the features in the room change. So we are actually quite excited to see whether we can derive hypotheses from this that we can then test actually in these sort of remapping experiments.
Okay, good. Thank you. So, Ross.
Sven, thanks very much for that. I'm interested in time in this. So back on slide 27, you had an axis of time with the events occurring there. Are you representing time explicitly there?
So
Or is that
the way that we're doing this here in this example is just we can create our two base x and base y vector, but we can just create another base vector. This is just some random vector. And then from there, we can do the same fractional power encoding kind of trick. And this would then represent the time also as another feature that we can bind into the vector. And honestly, this is, yeah.
No, sorry, you finish off here.
This is essentially just trying to make the point that it's not a necessarily spatial thing. It's just that we can encode continuous variables with this, and time would be just another extension that we can bind using this fractional power encoding trick into the representation here.
Yeah, okay, because I mean that was the part I was getting to was the actual representation of time you're using. So I mean, if you're treating time as a spatial dimension, then effectively you've still got to have an external source of the absolute value of time, which could be interesting in its own right. But I was wondering then, because later on when you were talking about location in terms of an egocentric representation, so where instead of representing location in terms of absolute external coordinates, it's in terms of relationship to objects in the environment, that you might do a similar thing with your representation of time. So perhaps you have some local representation, so you've got limited amount of future and past window, but over longer time spans, perhaps different instants in time are more represented by where you are relative to events before and after.
That's
it just
a
struck
really
me
cool
an
idea.
interesting parallel
Yeah.
of allocentric, egocentric, but moving that into the temporal dimension.
Yeah, that's true. That's a really cool idea.
Okay, anyway, so you answered the question. So thank you.
We have a question in the chat from Tyler. Basic question. How are state GC stored? Are they aggregated as single vector store or individual items?
So in this example here, for all intents and purposes, we have this one population here, and it's the bundle of all the states. And this gives us just one vector. So we can write this out as the different features, but the end result is just one vector for each time step that we're getting. For all the simulation reasons in the end, what we are essentially doing is, so although we are thinking of this as a dynamic vector that changes over time, we keep a history and just write it to memory and then keep track of this in this way for later analysis. But for all intents and purposes, they are each individual ID and distance vector here is bundled together, so aggregated, if you will, into one representation. And then this is your final grid cell state for this one position in time. This will evolve over multiple time steps. All right.
Okay. So let me ask if we have more questions. Maybe we have time for one more question before we complete the seminar. Well, if not, then the only thing remains to say thank you once again, Sven. It was really exciting start of the season, so really inspirational. Thank you for the great talk, and for the rest of you, thank you for joining, and welcome next time in 2 weeks, where we will have a great talk about foundation of VSA using category theory by Nolan Cho from Canada. So thanks for today. Have a great week.
All right. Thanks.
And,
Thanks for having me.
Yes. See you in 2 weeks from now.
See you.
everyone.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.